6 children, 1 dying cabin. A blizzard with no end. The mother was dead. The father had vanished into the storm, and behind that rotting wooden door, the wind was swallowing everything that remained. 14 years old. Abigail Reed had no time to grieve. She had to keep 6 lives breathing until morning. The food was gone. The firewood was nearly spent, and in her arms, a newborn baby was fading by the hour. This is the story of the children the world forgot, and the one man who refused to look away. If this story reaches your heart, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this journey travels. Now stay with me, because every moment from here will not let you go. The fire was lying. That was the first thing Abigail Reed noticed when she woke before dawn on the 6th morning. The way the embers still glowed a faint, deceiving orange, the way they cast the illusion of warmth across the log walls of the cabin. She lay still for one careful moment, listening. The twins were breathing. The storm was still screaming. Her brothers hadn't moved from their huddle near the far wall. Everything was exactly as she had left it when she'd finally allowed herself 2 hours of sleep. And yet something felt different. Something felt worse. She sat up slowly, her joints aching with a cold that had stopped feeling like cold 3 days ago and had started feeling like something permanent, like her bones had simply decided to become ice themselves. She pressed her palm flat against the earthen floor and pushed herself to standing, steadying herself against the rough-hewn table that had been her mother's pride just 9 days ago. 9 days. She tried to count backward and couldn't quite make the numbers feel real. 9 days ago, her mother had been alive. 9 days ago, her father had been laughing at something Caleb said at supper. 9 days ago, this cabin had smelled like cornbread and pine smoke, and her mother's lavender soap. Now it smelled like cold ash and sour milk, and the particular kind of silence that settles into a place where children are trying very hard not to cry. Abigail crossed to the stove. She didn't need to open the iron door to know what she would find. She had been counting every log, every split piece of kindling for 2 days now, rationing them the way she rationed the last quarter sack of cornmeal, the way she rationed everything, with the grim arithmetic of a 14-year-old girl who had learned more about survival in 6 days than most people learn in a lifetime. She opened the door anyway. 3 logs. Maybe 4 hours of heat, if she was careful. If the wind outside didn't find another crack to push through. If the babies slept and didn't need to be walked, which burned through warmth faster than anything else. 4 hours, she thought. And then what? She didn't answer herself. She had learned not to. Behind her, something shifted in the pile of buffalo robes and wool blankets near the east wall. Elias sat up first. He always did. 15 years old and already carrying himself like a man who had been handed a burden he hadn't asked for and refused to set down. His dark hair was flattened on one side, his jaw set in that particular way he had developed in the last 6 days. That careful blankness that meant he was thinking hard about something he didn't want to say out loud. He looked at the stove. He looked at Abigail. He didn't ask the question. She answered it anyway. 4 hours, she said quietly. Maybe 5 if I bank it right. Elias nodded, slow and deliberate. I'll go out again this morning. There's still timber stacked along the north face of the barn. I couldn't reach it yesterday because of the drifts, but if Caleb's not going out in that. The words came out harder than she intended. She softened them. He's 12, Elias. I was 12 once. He said it without heat, just plain and factual. I could have handled it. You were never 12 the way he's 12. That silenced him, because it was true, and they both knew it. Caleb had their mother's gentleness, their mother's tendency to feel everything twice. Once when it happened, and once again later. Alone. Where no one could see. He had been the one, 2 nights ago, who had quietly unraveled in the corner when he thought everyone was asleep, his shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs a boy makes when he is trying very hard to hold himself together and failing. Abigail had lain awake and listened and not gone to him, because she had understood. Some griefs need to be private to survive them. I'll go, Elias said. Alone, if I have to. We need the wood. I know. She looked at him for a long moment. Not until it's light? Not until I can watch you from the window and see you the whole way? He nodded again. Something passed between them. an acknowledgement that did not need words, a language they had invented together over the course of the worst week of their lives. The twins woke at almost the same moment, as they always did, as if even separated from each other by the small wooden box that served as their shared cradle. They remained somehow synchronized, still operating according to some calendar only they could feel. Samuel cried first, a strong cry, demanding, indignant, the cry of a baby who knew what he wanted and expected to receive it. Even in the worst moments of the past 6 days, Samuel's cry had retained that quality, that stubborn insistence on being alive, and Abigail had found herself grateful for it in a way she couldn't quite explain. Hope's cry was different. It had always been different. From the first night, from the terrible night when the midwife had placed 2 small bundles in Abigail's arms and told her in a low, carefully controlled voice that there was nothing more to be done for their mother, that she was gone, that Abigail needed to keep these babies warm and dry and fed. From that first night, Hope's cry had been softer, thinner, the kind of sound that made you lean closer to make sure it hadn't stopped. Tonight it was thinner than it had ever been. Abigail crossed to the cradle and lifted Samuel first, pressing him against her shoulder and patting his back with a firm, rhythmic motion that she had learned from watching her mother with Caleb years ago, a memory she hadn't known she was storing. He quieted almost immediately, turning his face into the curve of her neck with a snuffling, rootling urgency that broke her heart because there was nothing she could give him that he needed most. She had no milk. She had tried. She had tried everything she could think of, had pressed chamomile tea sweetened with the last of the sugar between his lips, had mashed cornmeal into a thin paste and coaxed both babies to take it, tiny amounts at a time. Samuel had taken it. Samuel was surviving on sheer bloody-minded will, the same as the rest of them. Hope was not taking it anymore. Abigail reached for her second twin with one arm, still holding Samuel against her shoulder, and she felt it immediately. The looseness. The way the baby's body didn't quite have that tight animal tension that healthy newborns have. Hope was warm enough, bundled as she was in every spare scrap of fabric Abigail had been able to find. But she was lighter than yesterday. She was always lighter than yesterday. "I've got you," Abigail whispered. The words were automatic, worn smooth by repetition. She had said them so many times in 6 days that they had become something closer to a reflex than a promise. "I've got you, Hope. Stay with me. Stay with me." Hope made a small sound, not quite a cry, not quite a sigh, and turned her face weakly toward Abigail's neck. 10-year-old Lucy appeared at Abigail's elbow so quietly that she nearly startled. That was Lucy's particular talent, the ability to materialize exactly where she was needed without announcement, without fuss, her dark eyes already assessing, already adjusting. She was the youngest of the older children, and she had spent the past 6 nights doing something that Abigail had only slowly recognized as extraordinary. She had appointed herself the twins' guardian in the darkness. Every time Hope or Samuel stirred, Lucy had been there, humming low under her breath, tucking blankets tighter, holding small fingers. She had not slept more than an hour at a stretch in 3 days. "Let me take Samuel," she said now, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone twice her age. "You need both hands for Hope." Abigail transferred Samuel without argument. The baby fussed briefly, then settled against Lucy's small shoulder with the familiarity of long practice. "She's lighter again," Abigail said quietly, meaning Hope, not looking up. Lucy didn't answer immediately. Then, "I know, I felt it last night." A pause. "Is it the cold, or is it—" She stopped. "I don't know," Abigail said honestly. She had learned in 6 days that there was a particular cruelty in dishonest reassurance. The children could feel the falseness of it, and it made everything worse, added a layer of loneliness to the fear. So she had stopped. "I don't know, Lucy. I'm keeping her as warm as I can. We could put her closer to the stove." "I thought about that. The heat's not even enough. It might dry her out more than it helps." Lucy considered this seriously, nodding with that solemn gravity that had always been her particular character and now seemed almost unbearably appropriate. "What do we do?" The question was genuine. It was not a challenge, not a plea. It was simply a request for information from someone who trusted that Abigail had information to give. And that trust, that uncomplicated faith, was one of the heaviest things Abigail had ever carried. "We keep going," she said. "That's what we do." Caleb woke later than the others, as he always had, even in the before times, and he sat up from the blankets with his eyes still fogged with sleep, blinking at the gray half-light that struggled through the cabin's single frost-covered window. For just a moment, that merciful half-second between sleeping and waking, his face was soft and unguarded, still a child's face. Then memory returned, visible as a shadow crossing a field, and the softness went away. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Abigail answered. He looked at the stove. He looked at the twins. He looked at Abigail with those perceptive, feeling eyes that saw too much. "You slept?" "A little." "You don't look like a little." "Thank you, Caleb." The ghost of something that had once been his ordinary 12-year-old smirk crossed his face and was gone. He untangled himself from the blankets and stood, stretching with a wince. "What do you need me to do?" This was the thing about all of them, Abigail thought. This was the thing that simultaneously undid her and held her together. Not one of them had collapsed. Not one of them had refused. They had each, in their own way, looked at the catastrophe around them and asked, "What do you need me to do?" As if they already knew that survival was a collective project, that it required each of them to keep performing their particular function even when every instinct screamed otherwise. Their mother had made them that way. She felt certain of it. "Elias is going to the barn for timber when it's light enough," she said. "I need you to stay in here with me." He clearly wanted to argue. She could see it, the flicker of wounded pride, the 15-year-old wanting to be useful outside. But he nodded. "Okay," he said. "I'll stay." The storm had arrived 3 days after their father left. That was the sequence she returned to, obsessively, in the hours when she couldn't sleep. Her mother laboring through a long, terrible night, the twins arriving at dawn, small and red and outraged and alive. The midwife, old Mrs. Trask, who had come from the next homestead over and stayed through the birth, but left the following morning because her own family needed her. The way her mother had looked afterward, exhausted but luminous, that particular radiance that Abigail had seen on the faces of women who had just done something that cost everything and yet found themselves richer for it. She had held the twins. She had named them. Hope and Samuel, she had said. Hope, because we always need it. Samuel, because that was her father's name, and she believed in honoring the dead by giving their names to the living. And then, in the middle of the second night, her mother's fever had spiked. By morning, she was delirious. By that evening, she was gone. Their father, Thomas Reed, broad-shouldered and steady, a man who had never in Abigail's memory been undone by anything, had come apart in a way that was almost unbearable to witness. Not dramatically. Thomas Reed didn't do anything dramatically. He had sat very still at the side of his wife's bed for a long time after it was over. And then he had stood up, and his face had been a landscape she didn't recognize. The geography of a man whose map of the world had just been redrawn without warning. He'd said, in a voice that was carefully, terribly controlled, "The babies need a wet nurse. I have to find one. I have to find a doctor too. You're the oldest, Abigail. You know how to manage." She had not known how to manage. She had been 14 years old, and her mother had been dead for 8 hours, and she had 2 newborn babies in her arms, and she had absolutely no idea how to manage. But she had looked at her father's face, at the shattered geography of it, at the man who was using control as a lifeline, because without it he would simply stop functioning. And she had said, "Yes, Pa, I know." He had ridden out before noon. He had not come back. On the third day without word, the blizzard arrived, and the world outside the cabin became a solid white wall, and the last ribbon of connection to anything beyond these 4 log walls was severed. By mid-morning, Elias had made 2 trips to the barn. The first had taken 40 minutes. Abigail had stood at the window the entire time, watching his dark shape move through the white blindness of the storm, counting the seconds when she lost sight of him, not allowing herself to breathe properly until he reappeared. He had come back with his arms stacked high, his eyebrows and beard shadow white with ice. His hands so cold she had made him hold them over the stove until the color came back. The second trip took 25 minutes. He was faster now, had found his path. By noon, they had enough wood to last the day, possibly into tomorrow morning. Abigail had done the calculation 6 times, approaching it from different angles, hoping the math would give her a different answer. It didn't. Tomorrow morning. After that, she didn't know. She fed the older children what she could, a thin cornmeal porridge divided carefully into 5 portions, the twins' portions mashed fine and offered on the edge of a clean cloth. Samuel took his with that characteristic ferocity. Hope barely moved her lips. Abigail set Hope's bowl aside and lifted the baby again, holding her against the warmth of her own body. She could feel the fragile weight of her, could feel beneath the bundled blankets the too rapid flutter of the small heart, the shallow, quick-paced breathing. "Stay with me," she thought fiercely, silently. "You are not allowed to leave. I did not keep you alive for 6 days to let you leave now." She did not say it aloud. There was a superstition she had developed, wordless and instinctive, that to say the fear plainly was to invite it in. So she held it inward, and she held hope outward, and she stood by the inadequate warmth of the stove, and she waited for something she didn't know how to name. In the early afternoon, Elias pulled Abigail aside while Caleb and Lucy were occupied with the twins. He was trying to keep his voice neutral. She could hear the effort. "We should talk about tonight," he said. "About what happens if the storm doesn't break." "The storm will break," she said. "Abigail, it will break." He was quiet a moment, then, "We've been saying that for 3 days." She met his eyes. His were gray, like their father's, steady and direct, and right now they held something she recognized as the same quality she tried to keep off her own face. Not despair exactly, but its close neighbor. The acknowledgement that the odds were shifting in a direction that none of them wanted to look at straight. "I know," she said quietly. "Hope needs milk, real milk, not what we've been giving her." He paused. "She needs it today, Abigail, not tomorrow. Today. I know that too." "So what do we—" "I don't know." She said it clearly and deliberately, because she was done performing certainty she didn't have, at least with him. He was 15. He deserved the truth. "I don't know, Elias. I've been thinking about it all morning and I don't have an answer. If I did, I would have already used it." He absorbed this. His jaw worked. "Pa's not coming back," he said. And it came out like something he had been holding in his chest for days, something that had been pressing against his ribs from the inside, needing to be said before it broke him. "Is he?" Abigail looked at him for a long time. She thought about lying. She weighed it carefully, considered all the ways it might be merciful, all the ways it might be necessary. "I don't know," she said again. And then, because she could hear the inadequacy of it, and because he was 15 and not a child, "Something happened to him, Elias. If he could have come back, he would have. You know that." "Maybe he—" "You know that," she said gently. A long silence. The wind pushed against the cabin walls with a sound like something immense and alive pressing its weight against the wood, testing it, looking for weakness. "Yeah," Elias said at last. His voice was level. "I know that." Neither of them said the word. They didn't need to. It sat between them in the cold air of the cabin, that word heavy and irreversible, and they looked at it together, and then Elias straightened his shoulders the way their father used to when he was about to do something hard, and he said, "Okay, then we figure it out ourselves." "We've been figuring it out ourselves," Abigail said. "Yeah." And there it was again, the ghost of a smile, the echo of the boy he had been 3 weeks ago. "We have, haven't we?" The afternoon darkened early, the storm pressing what little winter light there was from the sky by 3 o'clock. The cabin interior closed in around them, lit only by the glow of the stove and one tallow candle that Abigail had rationed down to its last 2 inches. Lucy had sung to the twins for most of the afternoon. Simple songs. Nursery rhymes their mother had sung, the words coming back to Lucy apparently from somewhere below conscious memory, surfacing when she needed them. Her voice was small but steady, and the twins responded to it, Samuel's fussing quieting, Hope's restless little movements stilling into something that was almost peace. Caleb had sat for a long time staring at the frost patterns on the window. Then, without saying anything, he had retrieved their mother's Bible from the shelf above the door. Not to read from it, but to hold it, the way a person holds something that connects them to someone they have lost. And he had sat with it in his lap, and his eyes closed, and his face doing that complex, visible internal work that was so particular to him. Abigail did not disturb him. She stood at the window instead, watching the storm. The snow was horizontal now, driven by a wind that seemed to have no direction, and every direction simultaneously, filling the world beyond the glass with a white chaos that had swallowed the barn, swallowed the tree line, swallowed everything until there was nothing in the visible universe but this cabin and the children inside it. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let herself feel it, just for a moment, just for a breath. All of it. The fear, the exhaustion, the grief she had been carrying like a stone in her chest since the morning she'd sat with her brothers and sister and the two small sleeping babies and told them what had happened to their mother. The anger she couldn't afford to let herself feel fully, because if she started, she wasn't sure she'd be able to stop. The crushing, suffocating weight of responsibility for 4 lives besides her own. She let herself feel it. Then she straightened. She pulled her forehead from the glass. She turned back to the room. "Keep going," she told herself. "That's what you do." It was Lucy who heard it first. She stopped singing mid-phrase, her head coming up sharply, her eyes going to the window with an alertness that was startling in its intensity. For a moment she simply listened, and the others watched her, and the cabin was so silent that they could hear the wind finding the gap beneath the door, could hear the small crackling, settling of the fire, could hear their own breathing. "Something's outside," Lucy said. Caleb looked up from the Bible. Elias was on his feet before the words were finished. "It's just the storm," he said, but he moved toward the door anyway, instinctively. "It's not the storm," Lucy said. "Listen." They listened. And then they all heard it, a sound from outside. Not the irregular, directionless howl of the blizzard, but something else. Something with pattern to it. The creak of something moving, the low, barely audible sound of large animals in the wind. Abigail crossed the room in 4 strides and pressed her eye to the gap beside the window frame. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her temples. For a moment she saw nothing. White. Only white. And then, there, moving through the wall of snow like something emerging from another world entirely, the blurred, enormous shape of a wagon. 2 horses. A figure on the box, hunched against the storm, turning his head slowly, looking at the cabin, looking at the smoke, looking at them. She pulled back from the window. She turned to face her brothers and sister, and she saw in their faces what she knew was reflected in her own. Something that had not been present in this cabin for 6 days. Something so unfamiliar after so long that it took her a moment to name it. Hope. Not the baby. The other kind. "Someone's out there," she said. Her voice came out strange, thin and cracked. The voice of someone who had been holding everything together with both hands for so long that the smallest possibility of release was already threatening to undo her. She steadied it. "Someone's coming to the door." The knock, when it came, was 3 solid raps. Unhurried, deliberate, the knock of a man who was accustomed to harsh weather and was not alarmed by it, who had simply seen something and stopped. Abigail stood in front of her children. She put herself between the door and the 4 people she was responsible for, and she straightened her spine, and she reached out and lifted the latch. Cold exploded into the room like a living thing. And in the doorway stood a man she had never seen before. Tall and weathered, with ice in his beard and eyes the color of winter sky, carrying a buffalo robe in his arms, and looking at her with an expression that moved through surprise, confusion, and then settled into something that was simple and immediate and unmistakable. He understood what he was looking at. In one sweeping glance he had taken in the dying stove and the thin children and the cradle and the sound, the barely there sound, of a baby who was running out of time. "I saw your smoke," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried. "I wasn't expecting to find anyone here." Abigail held his gaze. She was aware distantly that she had not slept properly in days, that she was 14 years old and her knees were shaking with cold and exhaustion, that she was very possibly about to do something undignified like burst into tears in front of a complete stranger. She lifted her chin instead. "My name is Abigail Reed," she said. "These are my brothers and sisters. Our mother is dead and our father is missing and one of our babies is dying." She paused. She held his eyes and she said the things she had not been able to say, the admission she had been withholding even from herself, because to say it had felt like giving up. "We need help." The man in the doorway was still for one moment. He looked at her. He looked past her at the children, at the cradle, at the stove. Then he stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind him against the screaming wind, and something in the atmosphere of the cabin shifted, changed. The way the air changes when something that has been holding its breath for a very long time finally exhales. "My name is Gideon Cross," he said, "and I'm going to help you." He meant it. In the hours that followed, none of them would quite believe how completely he meant it. How a man they had never seen before, a stranger passing through a blizzard on a freight road that had no reason to bring him past their cabin, would set down everything he carried and pick up the weight of their survival instead. But that night, standing in the doorway with the cold behind him and the dying firelight ahead, with 6 children looking at him out of faces that had learned not to hope and were now, helplessly, beginning to hope again. That night, Gideon Cross had already made his decision. He just hadn't said so yet. Gideon Cross had seen a great many things in his 41 years on the frontier. He had seen men die badly and men die well. He had seen rivers swallow wagons whole and fires take homesteads down to their foundations in the time it took to draw a breath. He had buried a horse in a snowdrift and walked 11 miles in boots that had no right to still be on his feet. He had spent 3 winters trapping alone in mountain country where the nearest human being was 2 days' ride in any direction, and he had come to understand solitude the way a man understands weather, not as something to be fought, but as something to be read, respected, navigated. He was not, by any reasonable definition of the word, a man who was easily shaken. But standing in the doorway of that cabin, looking at what the lamplight revealed, at the thin, hollow-eyed girl who had just told him her mother was dead and her father was missing and her baby sister was dying, and had told him all of this in a voice that did not waver, with the particular steadiness of someone who has passed the point where breaking down is an available option, Gideon Cross felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in a long time. He stepped inside and pulled the door closed, and he stood for a moment letting his eyes adjust and taking inventory the way he'd been trained to take inventory in his army years. Rapid, systematic, emotionless. He filed away what he saw without allowing himself to react to it yet, because reaction could come later and assessment had to come first. The stove, nearly exhausted, not enough heat for the space. The food supply? The near-empty sack of cornmeal on the shelf told the story plainly. The children, 5 of them, counting the infant in the older girl's arms and the bundle in the wooden cradle. The older boy, 15 maybe, broad through the shoulders, standing in a position that said, clearly he had appointed himself the protector of this room and was waiting to determine whether Gideon required protecting against. The younger boy, 12 or so, watching from the corner with wide, careful eyes. The small girl, 10 perhaps, holding the second infant against her shoulder with practiced ease, her gaze direct and measuring. And the girl in front of him, Abigail. 14 years old, holding a baby who was too still, too quiet, with the posture of someone who has been refusing to fall for so long that standing upright has become an act of will performed entirely in the absence of strength. He completed his assessment. Then he let himself feel it. "How long?" he asked, keeping his voice level, moving into the room and setting the buffalo robe down on the table without asking permission, because there was no time for the formalities of hesitation. "How long have you been alone here?" 6 days, Abigail said. "When did the last adult leave the property?" "My father left 6 days ago. The midwife left before that, before the storm." She watched him with those exhausted, wary eyes that had clearly been burned clean of the luxury of trust and were now performing their own careful assessment of him. He understood it. He didn't push against it. "The baby," he said, nodding toward the one she held. "How long has she been like this?" "Getting worse since yesterday morning." Her voice was careful, controlled. "She won't take food properly. Her breathing is fast." Gideon moved closer and she let him, stepping to the side to give him access while keeping herself within arm's reach. Protective, he registered. Even now, even running on nothing, her instinct was still to be between this child and any unknown quantity. He looked at the infant without touching her. The shallow breathing, the pallor beneath the newborn's redness. The way she didn't react to his nearness the way healthy newborns react, with that sharp animal alertness. His jaw tightened. He kept his face neutral. "She needs milk," he said. "Real milk. Tonight." "I know that," Abigail said, and there was something in the way she said it, flat and exhausted and threaded through with the specific anguish of knowing exactly what the problem is and having no means of solving it, that hit him somewhere unarmored. "There's a settlement," he said. "Harlan's Crossing, 14 miles east, something shifted in the room. He felt rather than saw it. The older boy straightening, the younger one looking up, the small girl going still. "In this storm," Elias said from across the room. It wasn't quite a question. It was a man's assessment wearing a boy's voice. "In this storm," Gideon confirmed. He looked at the boy steadily. "I've driven in worse." "Have you?" Elias said. "Yes." He held the boy's eyes for a moment. Let him look. Let him measure. Let him come to whatever conclusion he was going to come to. And then he looked back at Abigail. "My wagon's outside. 4-horse team, heavy freight rig, high-walled box. I've got supplies on board, food, blankets, a medical kit. I can have everyone loaded in 20 minutes." The silence that followed was different from the silence that had filled this cabin before he arrived. This silence had texture to it, had dimension. It was the silence of people who have been so deep in despair for so long that the first offering of an alternative feels not like relief, but like a trick, like something too sharp-edged to touch without first understanding what it would cost. Abigail looked at him. "Why?" she said. He blinked. Of all the questions she might have asked, he hadn't expected that one first. The logistics, the distance, the storm conditions, those he'd prepared for. But she had gone straight to the only thing that actually mattered. "Why would you do this?" she said. "You don't know us. You have freight on your wagon, you have a route. You'd be risking your horses, your cargo, your—" "Yes," he said. She waited. "Because you're here," he said simply, "and you need it." He paused. Something moved across his face that he didn't bother to hide, because it was the truth, and there was no time for anything less than truth. "I have my reasons that are my own. But the short answer is that I saw smoke from a cabin that I knew was supposed to be empty, and I stopped. And now I'm standing in front of 5 children who have been keeping each other alive for 6 days in a blizzard, and the smallest one is dying." He looked at her directly. "The why doesn't require any more explanation than that." Another silence. Then, from the corner of the room, Caleb spoke for the first time. "I think we should go," he said quietly. Abigail looked at him. He met her eyes with a steadiness that was very much their father's. "Ma would have gone," he said. "Pa would have wanted us to go." Something crossed Abigail's face, a flash of something raw and immediate that was there and gone before it could be named. Then she looked back at Gideon. 20 minutes, she said. 15, he said. "If we're efficient." For the first time in 6 days, something happened to Abigail Reed's face that was not grief or exhaustion or the careful blankness of someone managing catastrophe. It was small and brief and barely qualified as a smile, but it was there. "Then let's be efficient," she said. What followed was a controlled, organized scramble of the kind that only children who have been managing a crisis for almost a week are capable of producing. Gideon had expected chaos. He did not get it. What he got instead was a choreography that had clearly developed organically over the past 6 days. Each child moving to their particular function without instruction, without redundancy, without wasted motion. Elias packed. Caleb retrieved. Lucy wrapped the twins with a deftness that would have been remarkable in someone twice her age, layering blankets with the focused precision of someone who had done this exact thing many times, in the dark, alone. Gideon went back to his wagon. He worked fast, clearing space in the wagon bed, moving crates of freight to the sides, building a kind of nest at the center with every blanket and buffalo robe he carried, of which there were several, because Gideon Cross was a man who prepared for winter travel with the seriousness of someone who had learned his lessons the hard way. He unhitched his lead horse briefly to walk it in place, keeping it warm. He checked the runners on the wagon wheels, checked the harness rigging, checked the brake lines. His breath came in clouds. The storm pressed against him from every direction. The temperature had dropped another several degrees since he'd stopped, and the wind had a quality to it now that he recognized from experience. The deep cold that comes in the small hours before dawn when a blizzard has settled in with no intention of leaving quickly. He went back inside. The children were ready, standing in the middle of the cabin with their bundles and their twins and their thin, resolute faces. They looked, he thought, and the thought caught in his chest unexpectedly, like something from a painting of the frontier that left out all the romance and kept only the truth. "Elias," he said, "I need your help getting the cradle secured in the wagon. Can you carry it?" "Yes," Elias said, and picked it up without hesitation. "Caleb, you'll take the supply pack and the cornmeal sack. Don't set them down until I tell you." Caleb nodded, hoisting both with the resigned competence of someone accustomed to doing things that are harder than they should be. "Lucy," the girl looked at him, "you're in charge of Samuel. Keep him inside your coat against your body. Don't let him out no matter what." "I know how to carry a baby," Lucy said, with a dignity that was so complete and unselfconscious that it stopped him for a half second. "I can see that," he said. "I'm telling you anyway because the cold outside is worse than what you felt in here, and I need you to be ready for it." She considered this. "Okay," she said. He looked at Abigail last. She had hope against her chest, wrapped in every layer of fabric that could be spared, and she was looking at him with an expression he was starting to recognize. The look of someone who has constructed an elaborate system of internal scaffolding to keep themselves upright, and is now being required to trust that someone else's scaffolding will hold while she reconfigures her own. "I'll take her," he said, meaning hope. "Once we're in the wagon, you'll need your hands to climb up." She hesitated only a fraction of a second. Then she nodded. "Let's go," she said. The cold when they opened the door was a physical impact. Gideon heard Caleb make a small, involuntary sound and heard it cut off immediately, the boy swallowing it, refusing to let it become a complaint. He heard Lucy murmur something to Samuel inside her coat. He felt Abigail step up close behind him, following in the windbreak of his body, and he moved deliberately, cutting a path through the drifted snow toward the wagon. Getting the children loaded took 6 minutes. Gideon lifted each one physically over the wagon side. No ceremony, no time for dignity. Caleb first, then Lucy, then Elias with the cradle, which he settled and wedged against the front wall with careful expertise. Abigail came last. She handed Hope to Gideon with an expression that suggested the act cost her something enormous, that placing this baby in the hands of a man she had known for 20 minutes required a kind of trust that her recent experience had given her very few reasons to possess. He held Hope in the crook of his arm, sheltering her from the wind with the front of his heavy coat, and he felt the alarming lightness of her, the too fast flutter of her breathing even through the layers of wrapping. "She's cold," he said. "She's been cold," Abigail said, climbing up and immediately reaching back for the baby. He transferred her carefully. Abigail tucked Hope beneath both their bodies, sharing warmth. Gideon climbed to the box, gathered the reins, checked that every child was under the buffalo robes. "Everyone hold on to something," he said. "It's going to be rough." "We know rough," Elias said, from somewhere in the bundled darkness of the wagon bed. Gideon almost smiled. He released the brake and signaled the horses forward. The wagon lurched into the storm. The first mile was the worst. The trail east from the cabin, and it could barely be called a trail, being in reality little more than a set of wagon ruts that Gideon had traveled enough times to carry in his memory rather than read from the ground, had been completely erased by the snow. He was navigating by memory and by the faint directional sense that years of frontier travel had built in him, the way a river pilot navigates by the feel of the current rather than the sight of the banks. The wind came from the northwest, which meant it was slightly behind them on this heading, which was the one advantage the storm was willing to offer. He took it and drove into it. Beneath the robes, the children huddled. He could hear them, the muffled sounds of small bodies adjusting, of Samuel fussing and being quieted, of Caleb asking something in a low voice and Elias answering in a lower one. He could hear Abigail, occasionally, humming the same low, rhythmic sound he'd heard Lucy using earlier, and he understood that she was directing it at Hope, that it was not comfort so much as contact. I'm here, stay with me." The second mile opened slightly. The trail found itself again beneath his runners, the packed earth of the main freight road giving the horses something solid to push against. And the team, 4 Missouri drafts he'd had for 3 years, steady animals with good winter sense, leaned into their harnesses with the reliable power that had gotten him through worse than this. He still couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. At the 3rd mile, one of the rear wheels hit a buried rock, and the wagon lurched hard to the left. And for one terrible second, the whole rig tipped, far enough that Gideon felt the right wheels leave the ground, far enough that he heard the children cry out beneath the robes, far enough that his hands locked on the reins, and his body threw itself to the right side of the box, and he hauled with everything he had. The wagon came back down. He heard Elias, "Everyone okay?" A beat, 2 beats. Caleb, "Yeah." Lucy, "Samuel's fine, I've got him." Abigail, Hope's okay. I've got her." A pause, and then quieter, to the baby, "I've got you." Gideon let out a breath. He straightened on the box. He drove on. At the 5th mile, Elias climbed from the wagon bed to the box and sat beside him without asking permission. Gideon didn't object. The boy sat with his hands braced against the footboard and his eyes forward, watching the white wall of the storm the way Gideon was watching it, learning the patterns of it, and after a mile of silence he said, "The lead horse on the right is favoring her left foreleg." Gideon looked. He was right. He'd noticed it half a mile back. "Old injury," he said. "She'll be fine for another 10 miles. She knows her limits." Elias was quiet for a moment. "How do you know she knows her limits?" "Because she's told me before." He felt the boy look at him. "Animals communicate. You learn to listen." Another silence. The wagon moved through the dark and the white. "Our pa knew horses," Elias said. Not an announcement, just a fact, offered into the space between them, the way you offer something you want to be heard but aren't ready to discuss. "Sounds like a good man to know," Gideon said. "He was." A pause. The wind pushed. "He is." Gideon said nothing. Some corrections needed to be left to their own time. From the wagon bed came Lucy's voice, raised slightly above the wind. "Abigail, she's shaking." The cold in those 3 words was not the cold of the storm. Abigail's voice came back immediately, low and controlled. "I know. Keep Samuel warm, don't let him see." Gideon's hands tightened on the reins. "How far?" Elias said. His voice had changed. 8 miles? That's too far." "It's not too far. I'll get there in 2 hours." Hope might not have 2 hours. He said it plainly, without drama, and the plainness of it was worse than drama would have been. Gideon thought fast. He ran through what he knew of this road, this terrain, the stops and structures between here and Harlan's Crossing. He discarded 3 options before the 4th one surfaced. "There's a way station," he said. 4 miles, McNally's. He winters over there. He'll have livestock, which means he might have a nursing cow or a goat. It won't be what she needs, but it'll keep her going until we reach town. Elias looked at him with those gray eyes that were so much older than his face. "Might," he said. "Might," Gideon agreed. "It's better than what we have now." The boy faced forward again. He braced his hands harder against the footboard. "Then drive faster," he said. Gideon drove faster. The 4 miles to McNally's way station were the longest Gideon had covered since the winter he'd spent on the Montana border, and he had spent that winter in circumstances that still occasionally surfaced in his sleep. He pushed the horses harder than he liked. He pushed them because Elias was sitting beside him and had said drive faster and was not a boy asking a man for comfort, was instead someone who had correctly assessed the situation and issued a directive, and Gideon had enough respect for correct assessment to follow it regardless of the age attached to it. The way station resolved out of the storm like something imagined, a dark bulk against the white. A faint light in one window, smoke from a stovepipe that told him McNally was awake or had been recently. He pulled the team up and set the brake and said, "Stay here," and dropped from the box and crossed to the door and knocked. Then knocked again, harder. The door opened to reveal a man of about 60, built like a fence post, wearing the expression of someone who had been awakened by a noise and was prepared to be displeased about it. The displeasure evaporated when he took in the wagon, the horses, the look on Gideon's face. "Cross," he said. "McNally. I've got 5 children in that wagon. One of them is a newborn who needs milk tonight or she won't see morning. Tell me you have something." McNally looked at the wagon. Something shifted in his face, something pragmatic and immediate and fundamentally decent. "Got a nanny goat," he said. "Freshened 2 weeks ago. Milk's good." "That'll do. Get it." McNally got it. What happened in the next half hour at McNally's way station was not, by any external standard, remarkable. A man produced a goat. A woman, McNally's wife, who had appeared from the back room with her hair in a braid and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the brisk efficiency of someone who had raised children on the frontier and knew which emergencies required weeping and which ones required warm milk, showed Abigail how to administer the milk carefully, slowly, in tiny amounts from a cloth soaked and squeezed between the baby's lips. They went inside, all of them, while the horses rested and the storm continued outside, and Mrs. McNally built up her stove and produced cornbread and salt pork and hot water for tea, and did all of this without commentary, without fuss, in the manner of a woman who understood that what these children needed was not questions or pity, but the simple physical fact of warmth and food provided by competent hands. Caleb ate 3 pieces of cornbread and fell asleep at the table with his head on his arms before he'd finished the 4th. Lucy sat beside the stove with Samuel, and the goat's milk went into him and stayed. And the sound he made afterward, that particular sound of an infant who has finally been adequately fed, a sound somewhere between a sigh and a groan that travels all the way to the tips of the toes, made Lucy laugh for the first time in 6 days. It was a small laugh, surprised out of her, quickly swallowed. But it was there. Abigail sat in the corner with Hope and the milk-soaked cloth, working with the patience of someone who has nothing left but patience and has therefore discovered that patience is inexhaustible. Drop by drop. Squeeze and wait. Squeeze and wait. The baby's response was slow, tentative, not the strong pull of a healthy newborn, but something weaker, more effortful. But she was responding, she was taking it. Gideon sat across the room and watched. He had been watching these children for 2 hours now, and he was still not accustomed to what he was seeing. Not the suffering, but he had seen suffering before and knew its textures. What he was not accustomed to was the particular quality of the courage. It was not dramatic, it was not performed. It was simply present, in the way that water is present at the bottom of a well. Unremarkable, essential, there when you reach for it. Elias sat down beside him, having helped McNally see to the horses, carrying the particular settled quiet of someone who has completed a physical task and allowed it to temporarily displace thought. They sat in silence for a while. Then Elias said, "You said you had your own reasons for stopping." Gideon looked at the fire. "I did say that." "You don't have to tell me." "No," Gideon agreed. "I don't." A pause. The fire spoke in the language of fire. "I had a family once," Gideon said. He had not planned to say it. It arrived in his mouth the way truths sometimes do, unbidden, finding their own moment without consulting him. "Lost them. Fever, 8 years ago. My wife, my son." He paused. He was 3. Elias was very still beside him. "I've been moving since then," Gideon said. "Routes, freight, the road. Easy enough to keep moving when there's nothing that requires you to stop." He looked at the fire for a moment longer, then looked at the boy. "I don't know why I stopped today. I saw the smoke and I stopped. That's all." Elias held his gaze steadily. Then he looked away, back at his sisters, at Abigail working patiently in the corner with Hope, at Lucy laughing quietly at the contented baby in her arms. "I'm glad you did," he said. It was simply said. No performance, no weight placed on it beyond what it contained. Gideon Cross, who had spent 8 years arranging his life so that nothing required him to stay anywhere long enough to matter, felt the words settle into him like heat into cold hands. Gradual, almost painful, undeniably real. "So am I," he said. Across the room, Hope made a sound. Not a cry. Something less urgent and more alive. A small, effortful sound that said, "I'm here. I'm still here." Abigail looked down at her with an expression that she probably didn't know was visible, that she probably would have controlled if she'd remembered to, open and overwhelmed and achingly, completely loving. Gideon looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at the children who were still fighting to stay alive, and the girl who had kept them that way with nothing but herself for 6 days. And he made a decision that had been building, he realized, from the moment he'd first seen the smoke. 4 more miles to Harlan's Crossing. He would see them there tonight. He would see them safe, see the baby to a doctor, see the older children fed and warm and settled. He would do what needed to be done. And then, for the first time in 8 years, he was going to figure out what came next. They left McNally's way station at what the old man's clock said was 9:30 in the evening. though time had long since lost its ordinary meaning for the children in the back of Gideon's wagon. Time, for the past 6 days, had been measured in a different currency, in logs burned, in ounces of cornmeal, in the number of times Hope's breathing had gone shallow before steadying again. The clock on McNally's wall was a relic from another world, the world where time moved in regular increments and people slept in beds and ate meals at predictable intervals. And Abigail looked at it on her way out the door with something close to bewilderment, as if she were reading a sign in a language she had once known and was only now beginning to remember. Mrs. McNally pressed a bundle into her arms at the threshold. Cornbread wrapped in cloth, a small jar of preserved peaches, 2 strips of dried venison. She did it without comment, without the kind of pitying look that Abigail had been steeling herself to endure once they reached people. And for that particular mercy, Abigail was grateful in a way she couldn't have articulated. "You keep that baby warm," Mrs. McNally said, looking directly at her with eyes that had seen a great deal and been softened rather than hardened by it. "She's tougher than she looks. They usually are." "Yes, ma'am," Abigail said. "So are you," the woman added, and then stepped back inside before Abigail could respond, closing the door with the brisk finality of someone who had said what needed saying and saw no reason to elaborate. Abigail stood on the step for one moment in the howling dark, holding Hope and the bundle of food, and she allowed herself to feel it, the small, fierce warmth of being seen by another woman on the frontier who understood exactly what it cost to keep going and had chosen to acknowledge it without making it into something sentimental. Then she turned and walked back to the wagon. Gideon was already on the box. Elias was beside him again, which seemed to have become the boy's established position without anyone formally deciding it, the way things become established when people are moving too fast for formality. Caleb had been lifted back into the wagon bed still half asleep and was now wrapped in buffalo robes with the concentrated unconsciousness of a child whose body had simply overridden his will and taken the rest it required. Lucy sat upright with Samuel inside her coat, the baby warm and fed and quieter than he had been in days, his small fist curled against Lucy's collarbone. Abigail climbed up, settled Hope against her body, and felt the wagon begin to move. The 4 miles between McNally's and Harlan's Crossing were, in theory, the easiest portion of the journey. The road was better maintained here, the terrain flatter, the freight traffic heavy enough even in winter that the trail held its shape beneath the snow. In theory. In practice, the storm had worsened in the hours since Gideon had left the main road to investigate the cabin's smoke, and what had been severe when they started had become something with teeth to it, something with intention, as if the weather had noticed their determination to survive it and taken the challenge personally. The wind came directly at them now, northeast to southwest, straight into the horses' faces, and Gideon watched his lead animals lean into it with a grim, experienced competence that he recognized as the equine equivalent of his own approach to difficulty, not fighting it, not yielding to it, but finding the narrow line between resistance and endurance and walking it one step at a time. He talked to them, low and continuous, not words exactly, but the tonal language that horses understand better than vocabulary. Steady, good, forward, steady. Elias listened to this without comment for the better part of a mile. Then, does it help? Talking to them in the storm? Keeps them oriented to my voice, Gideon said. When they can't see and they can't feel the road properly, they follow the sound, something familiar in all the noise. The boy considered this. That's what Abigail did, he said. For us, in the cabin. He wasn't looking at Gideon, was looking forward into the white dark. We couldn't see anything either. She just kept talking, kept telling us what to do next. Even when... He stopped. Even when she didn't know, Gideon said. A beat. Yeah. Gideon said nothing. He drove. In the wagon bed, Abigail was doing the same thing she had been doing for 6 days. She was managing. Hope was warmer than she'd been at the cabin. The goat's milk had done something, had put some small reserve of energy back into the baby's system that was visible in the fractional improvement of her color, the slightly less alarming pace of her breathing. It was not enough. Abigail understood that with the clear-eyed pragmatism that had become her dominant mode of perception, what Hope had received at McNally's was borrowed time, not a solution, and borrowed time ran out. She tightened her arms and leaned over the baby and hummed. She had been humming the same song, more or less, since the second night after the twins were born, when she had first realized that hope responded to it, that the sound of it, low and unmelodic and imperfect as it was, had some organizing effect on the baby's restlessness, some quality that said you are not alone in terms that a 3-day-old infant could receive. She didn't know where the song came from. It wasn't anything her mother had sung or anything she could attach words to. It had arrived fully formed from someplace below memory in the second hour of the second night, and she had simply continued it. Beside her, in the darkness under the robes, Lucy spoke. "She's looking at you," Lucy said. Abigail looked down. Hope's eyes, dark and unfocused in the way of newborns, that seeing and not seeing gaze, were turned toward her face with something that was less than intention and more than accident. "Hi," Abigail said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, freighted with 6 days of things she hadn't been able to say. "Hi, Hope. Still with me?" The baby's mouth moved. Something twitched in her small face. Not quite a response, not quite recognition, but something in the neighborhood of both, something that said, "I can hear you. I'm trying." "Good," Abigail said. "Keep trying." Lucy was quiet for a moment, then, "Abigail, when we get to town, what happens to us?" The question arrived with the particular directness that was Lucy's signature. Not cruel, not careless, simply the question that needed to be asked by the person willing to ask it. Abigail had been thinking about this since the moment Gideon had said the word town. She had been turning it over in the back of her mind while managing everything else. The way you work at a knot with your fingers while your eyes are occupied elsewhere, methodical and persistent. And she had arrived, in the past 2 hours, at something that was not quite an answer, but was at least an honest accounting. "I don't know exactly," she said. "People will help. That's what towns do when something like this happens." "Will they try to separate us?" The question was so precise, so unerring in its aim at the thing Abigail feared most, that she was silent for a moment. "No one is going to separate us," she said. The words came out with more force than she'd planned. "I won't let that happen, Lucy. Whatever comes next, we stay together." "How?" "I don't know yet, but we do." She said it the same way she had said we keep going in the cabin 6 days ago. Not as a statement of certainty, but as a declaration of intent, as if the saying of it could bear some structural weight in the world. Lucy thought about this for a while. Samuel stirred against her, and she adjusted him automatically. Then, "I believe you," she said simply, and closed her eyes. It was, Abigail thought, possibly the most significant thing anyone had said to her in a week. The crisis came at the 3rd mile, which was the mile that Gideon had been watching for without saying so, because he knew this stretch of road the way he knew the particular bad character of every difficult thing he'd navigated repeatedly. Not with fear, but with a specific, prepared respect. There was a long depression in the terrain here, a shallow bowl where the land dipped between 2 rises, and in ordinary winter conditions it collected drifts. In a blizzard of this magnitude, it collected something significantly worse. He felt the horse's footing change before he saw the drift, felt it in the way the lead pair checked, that microscopic hesitation of animals registering that the ground ahead is not what the ground behind has been. He had perhaps 2 seconds in which the correct response was to turn, and he made the wrong call. He drove forward. The wagon hit the drift at half speed, and the snow came up around the wheels immediately. Not the ordinary drag of packed snow, but the sinking, gripping resistance of a drift that was 4 feet deep and had developed a crust that broke under the wheels' weight and then closed around them. The horses lurched forward, lost traction, lunged again. The wagon didn't move. "Hold on," Gideon said, which was both an instruction and the understatement of the evening. He set the brake and climbed down into snow that came to mid-thigh and moved to the horses, working fast, talking them down from the edge of panic that bad footing and worse darkness had begun to kindle in them. They were good horses. They listened. He got them settled in 30 seconds and then stood in the drift in the roaring dark and thought. Elias was beside him before he'd finished thinking. "What do we do?" The boy was up to his waist in snow and showed no particular inclination to comment on this. "We dig," Gideon said. "Front wheels first. I need you on the left side. I'll take the right. We clear down to the axle and pack the sides with loose snow so the wheel has something to push against instead of sinking. I don't have a shovel. There's one tied to the left side of the wagon, and a hand axe. Bring both." Elias retrieved them and brought the axe to Gideon without being asked to specify which tool went to whom. Smart boy. Gideon used the axe to break the crust around the front right wheel while Elias shoveled, and they worked in the wind without speaking because the wind made speaking expensive, and neither of them was inclined to spend the energy on anything that wasn't the immediate problem. From the wagon, the sound of the children, and above it, Abigail's voice, low and even, telling Caleb and Lucy what was happening, what Gideon and Elias were doing, what they needed to do in the wagon, which was stay still and stay warm and not add to the difficulty by being frightened, though she didn't put it that way. She said, "They know what they're doing. Hold Samuel and keep the robes tight and let them work." Caleb appeared at the wagon's side. "I can help." "Stay in the wagon," Abigail and Gideon said simultaneously from different directions. A pause from Caleb. Then, "Okay." It took 22 minutes. Gideon counted them with the part of his mind that tracked such things automatically, the way an experienced freight man tracks time and distance even in the worst conditions, because time and distance are the only variables he can actually measure. 22 minutes of breaking crust and packing snow and easing the wheel forward by inches, and then a foot, and then 3 feet, and then, with a lurch and a grinding protest from the frozen axle, the wagon was free, and the horses had their footing, and Elias was back on the box before Gideon had finished retying the shovel. Gideon climbed up beside him. Both of them were breathing hard. Ice had formed in Gideon's beard, and he could no longer feel his left hand with any precision, which was a problem he filed for later. Elias's face was white with cold and something else, not quite exhilaration, not quite relief, but the particular expression of someone who has applied everything he has to a problem and watched it yield. "Good work," Gideon said. "You too," Elias said, as if they were equals on the box. And in this moment, in this storm, Gideon supposed they were. They drove on. The last mile was the quietest. The storm didn't lessen. It hadn't offered that concession and wasn't about to. But the horses had found their second wind, or something close to it, and the road had improved enough that they moved with a steadiness that felt, after what had come before, almost peaceful. The children in the wagon had gone quiet. Caleb was asleep again. Lucy was singing to Samuel just under the wind, her small voice doing the same work that Abigail's had done in the cabin. Not comfort exactly, but presence, the refusal to leave someone alone in the dark. Abigail held hope and did not sing. She had run out of song. She was simply there, body against body, warmth pooling between them, holding on with the same focused, unremarkable determination that she had been holding on with for 6 days, that had no dramatic quality to it, no grandeur, was simply the thing that had been required of her and that she had provided, continuously, without cessation, because the alternative was unthinkable. Hope was breathing. She was still breathing. It was enough. For this mile, for this moment, it was enough. The lights of Harlan's Crossing appeared in the snow like something dreamed. Not a dramatic emergence. No parting of the storm, simply a gradual brightening of the darkness ahead. A warm orange glow that resolved slowly into windows, into shapes, into the outline of buildings and a street and the particular smell of a settlement that has its stoves lit and its people inside them. Gideon had seen the lights of many towns from the box of this wagon over many years, had driven into settlements in darkness and weather without feeling much of anything beyond the practical satisfaction of a completed route. He felt something now, arriving at the edge of Harlan's Crossing. He identified it as he drew the horses down to a walk and began navigating the snow-packed main street. Relief. That was the primary component, and beneath it something more complicated that he hadn't felt since before he'd learned to stop staying in places long enough to feel it. He pulled up in front of the doctor's office. He knew where it was, had made this run enough times to know the layout of the town, and set the brake. He turned to Elias. "Go knock. Hard. Tell them I've got a sick infant and 4 other children who need attention." Use those exact words. Elias was off the box before Gideon finished the sentence. What happened in the next half hour in Harlan's Crossing happened the way things happen in small frontier settlements when word spreads and decency asserts itself. Rapidly, practically, without excessive ceremony. The doctor, a compact, sharp-eyed man named Alderman, who had been asleep but came fully awake in the 30 seconds between Elias's knock and the door opening, took one look at Hope, and moved with an efficiency that required nothing from anyone except to clear his path. He had the baby under good light and under examination within 2 minutes of Gideon bringing her through the door, and he was calling for his wife and for the woman down the street, and his wife was already at the door before he finished calling. The woman down the street was Clara Webb, 32 years old, 8 months past the birth of her own daughter, who arrived in her coat thrown over her nightgown and took in the situation with a single comprehensive glance that covered the doctor, the baby, and the exhausted girl who had been carrying her, and went directly to Abigail. "Give her to me," she said. Abigail looked at her. Something moved across her face, the long-practiced reflex of a girl who had learned that giving things up, even momentarily, created risks she couldn't control. I know what she needs," Clara said gently, firmly, with the authority of someone who had recently been in the precise physical situation this baby required. "I have milk, and she needs it now, and you need to let me help you." She held out her arms. "You've done everything right. Let me do this part." A long moment. Abigail's arms tightened fractionally around Hope, the last involuntary resistance of a body that had been holding on for so long it had forgotten how to release. Then, slowly, like something being carefully, deliberately undone, she transferred the baby. She stood watching. She didn't move away. She stood and she watched Clara settle onto the chair the doctor's wife brought, and she watched Hope respond. Watched the baby's mouth find what she needed. Watched the first strong pull. Watched the color begin, almost immediately, to change in that small face from the grayish translucence of insufficiency to something warmer, something more present. Abigail made a sound. It was small. She covered it immediately with her hand, pressed her knuckles hard against her mouth, and her eyes went very bright and her face did something complicated and private that she clearly had not intended anyone to witness. She turned slightly away, presenting her profile to the room. Gideon, who was standing near the door and had been watching all of this, looked away. He gave her the privacy of his inattention, which was the only privacy available in a small room full of people, and it was the best he could offer, and he offered it deliberately. Elias, who had been standing beside Gideon, moved to his sister. He didn't say anything. He stood next to her, his shoulder touching hers, and he looked at Hope and Clara Webb and the baby feeding with that strong, purposeful pull, and after a moment he exhaled, long and slow, the sound of someone releasing a breath they'd been holding for 6 days. On the other side of the room, Lucy had sat down on the floor with Samuel against her chest and gone immediately, completely, profoundly asleep, sitting upright against the wall, the baby sleeping with her. The doctor's wife covered them both with a blanket and left them there. Caleb stood in the middle of the room looking around at the walls, at the shelves of medical supplies, at the warm lamp-lit space, with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they weren't sure existed and is taking time to confirm that it's real. His eyes found Gideon's. "We made it," he said. It was not quite a question. "You made it," Gideon said. The boy looked at the floor for a moment, processing this. Then he looked back up. "Because of you. Because of all of you," Gideon said. "I drove the wagon. You kept each other alive long enough for me to find you." He paused. "That's not a small thing, Caleb. That's not a small thing at all." Caleb nodded slowly, seriously, the way he received everything. Twice, in his body, and then again somewhere deeper. Dr. Alderman crossed to Gideon after completing his examination of Hope. He was a man who communicated in the compressed language of someone accustomed to delivering information under time pressure. "She's undernourished, mildly hypothermic. The feeding is what she needed most. Clara will stay with her tonight, and I want to monitor her through tomorrow morning." He met Gideon's eyes. "You got her here in time. Another 2-3 hours." He didn't finish the sentence. "She's going to be all right?" Gideon said. The doctor looked at Hope, at the baby who was feeding with an intensity that had nothing small or fragile about it, that was in fact the purest possible expression of will operating at its most fundamental level. "Barring anything I'm not anticipating," he said. "Yes, she is." Gideon looked at the ceiling briefly. Then he looked at his hands, still cold, still marked by the work of the past 3 hours. He became aware, gradually, that Abigail was standing beside him. She had turned back to the room, had composed her face back to its usual careful steadiness, though her eyes were still too bright, and her voice, when she spoke, had a slightly different texture than usual, rougher, like wood grain running the wrong direction. "Dr. Alderman," she said, "what will you charge for tonight?" The doctor looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Gideon. Then he looked back at the 14-year-old girl who was, even here, even now, attending to the logistics. "We'll discuss it when everyone's rested," he said, not unkindly. "I'd like to discuss it now," Abigail said, "so I know what we owe." Something moved across the doctor's face, recognition, perhaps, the recognition of a particular kind of person. "Nothing," he said. "Not tonight. Tonight is not about what you owe." Abigail opened her mouth, closed it, nodded once, tightly, the nod of someone accepting something they're not entirely comfortable accepting. Gideon put a hand on her shoulder. Not heavily, not with any weight beyond contact, just enough to say it's all right to let people help you. She didn't pull away. She stood still under it for a moment, and then she looked up at him, and in her face he saw, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the grief, beneath the extraordinary controlled competence that had carried her through 6 days of what no 14-year-old should ever have had to carry. Something very young and very tired and very relieved. "Thank you," she said. She said it quietly, to him specifically. Not for the wagon or the road or the medical attention. Those things were their own thank you, and they both knew it. She said it for the particular quality of how he had done those things, for treating them as people rather than problems, for talking to Elias on the box as though his assessment mattered, because it did, for looking away when she broke, just for a second, because she needed to. "You would have found another way," he said, "if I hadn't come along." She looked at him steadily. "Maybe," she said, "but you did come along." "Yeah," he said, "I did." Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on Harlan's Crossing, battering the shutters, driving snow against the glass, rattling the stovepipes and pressing cold fingers under every door. Inside the doctor's office, 5 children who had refused to stop existing were, for the first time in 6 days, warm, fed, attended by competent hands, surrounded by people who knew they were there. The storm could do what it wanted. It had already lost. In the corner, Samuel made the small, involuntary sound of a deeply sleeping baby, content, unknowing, alive. Lucy, asleep against the wall beside him, turned her face slightly toward the warmth of the stove, and some tension that had been living in her small shoulders for 6 days went out of them all at once. Hope fed, and fed, and slowly, incrementally, with the determined thoroughness of someone making up for lost time, she grew stronger. And Gideon Cross, who had spent 8 years keeping himself in motion so that nothing could catch him, sat down in a chair in the corner of Dr. Alderman's office in Harlan's Crossing and stayed. The morning after the storm broke came in slowly, the way mornings do when the world has spent the night doing something violent and is now reassessing. The sky over Harlan's Crossing went from black to a deep bruised purple, then to the particular pale gray of winter dawn that carries no warmth but at least carries light. And the light fell across a town that was digging itself out with the methodical, unsurprised competence of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. Gideon had not slept. He had dozed, twice, in the chair in the corner of Dr. Alderman's office, coming back to full wakefulness both times within minutes, pulled up from the surface of sleep by the habit of 30 years that said you are responsible for something, and sleep is a liability. The something, in this case, was 5 children arranged in various states of unconsciousness around the doctor's front room, Caleb and Lucy sharing the narrow cot that the doctor's wife had made up near the stove, Samuel sleeping in a bureau drawer lined with blankets that Clara Webb had rigged with the practical ingenuity of a woman who had learned to solve problems with whatever was nearest, Elias on the floor with his coat for a pillow and his arms crossed over his chest with the dignity of someone who had decided that sleeping on a floor was a choice rather than a circumstance. And Abigail. Abigail had not slept either, or not much. She had held hope for the first 3 hours, Clara Webb handling the feeding, Abigail holding the baby in between, unwilling to let the distance between them exceed arm's reach. Around 2 a.m, Dr. Alderman had come to check Hope's temperature and color and had pronounced himself cautiously satisfied, and he'd said to Abigail, directly and without softening it, "She needs rest more than she needs holding right now. So do you." "They're the same prescription." Abigail had looked at him. "Put her down for 2 hours. the doctor said. "I'll be here. I'll wake you if anything changes." She had put Hope down. She had sat in the chair beside the makeshift cradle, an empty medicine crate lined with flannel that Alderman's wife had produced from somewhere, and she had closed her eyes and been asleep inside of 40 seconds, which was, Gideon thought, watching from across the room, probably the clearest possible evidence of how completely she had been running on empty. He watched her sleep for a while, this girl who had done an extraordinary thing with no tools except herself. And he thought about the particular kind of courage that has no audience and seeks none, that is performed in a cold cabin in the middle of a blizzard for the benefit of 4 people who are too young and too frightened to fully understand what they are receiving. He thought about his own son, who would have been 11 now, and he let himself think it, which he didn't often do, and he held it for a moment without flinching, and then he set it down again. The morning brought the town, not all at once, and not intrusively. The people of Harlan's Crossing were, in the main, a practical population with the good frontier sense to understand that there was a difference between being helpful and being a burden, and that showing up in large numbers at a doctor's office at 7 in the morning where exhausted children were sleeping was firmly in the second category. But they came. The baker's wife sent bread and a pot of butter. The woman who ran the dry goods store appeared at the door with 2 wool blankets and a set of children's clothes in various sizes, left them on the step without knocking. The liveryman, hearing that Gideon's horses had been driven hard through the night, showed up at the hitching post and led the team away to be watered and fed and examined, leaving a note that said simply, "No charge." By 9 in the morning, when the children began waking in stages, Samuel first, with his characteristic demanding announcement of consciousness. Then Caleb, sitting up with the dazed expression of someone who had slept so deeply he'd temporarily misplaced his own name. Then Lucy, who woke fully alert the way she did everything, eyes open and immediately surveying the room. There was a meal ready on the doctor's table that had been assembled by several different pairs of hands and covered enough plates for twice their number. Elias woke last. He lay still for a moment with his eyes open, looking at the ceiling, running through the same sequence Gideon suspected he ran through every morning. The rapid accounting, the inventory of what was still standing and what had been lost. Then he sat up, looked around the room, and his eyes found Gideon's. "Hope?" he said. "Better," Gideon said. "Doctor's happy with her this morning." Elias nodded. He looked at Abigail, still sleeping in the chair, and then at the crate cradle where Hope was sleeping with her fists curled under her chin, her color in the morning light unmistakably, undeniably better. Something moved in Elias's face, an expression he didn't police for once, didn't flatten into the controlled steadiness he'd been maintaining for a week. It was the face of a 15-year-old boy who had been carrying something enormous and had just felt the weight of it shift. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. Then he stood up, squared his shoulders, and went to wash his face. Abigail woke 20 minutes later to the sound of Caleb and Lucy arguing, quietly, in the particular register of children who know they're not supposed to be heard but cannot quite achieve silence, over which of them should eat the larger portion of the bread, each insisting the other take it. She opened her eyes, took in the room, checked Hope in a single reflexive movement, and then sat still for a moment longer than usual, just breathing. Then she looked at Gideon. "How long did I sleep?" 3 hours, maybe." She looked like she wanted to say something self-critical about this. He preempted it. The doctor ordered it. Consider it medical treatment. She considered pushing back on this and apparently decided against it. "Hope's color is better." "It is." She fed again at dawn. "Clara." She stopped, and something in her face shifted at the name. Clara was here all night. She was. "I need to thank her properly." "You will. She'll be back." Abigail looked at the food on the table. She looked at the blankets, the clothes, the bread, the accumulated evidence of a community that had been awake and attending. Her expression was careful and complicated, the expression of someone receiving generosity at a scale they're not sure they deserve and aren't certain how to hold. "People are being very kind," she said quietly. "Yes," Gideon said. "I don't know most of these people. They know what happened to you, or some of it." He paused. Small towns run on the currency of each other's difficulty. People help because they've needed help, and they remember what it felt like. She absorbed this. Then, almost to herself, "We're going to need more than kindness. We're going to need..." She stopped. She looked at the children. She looked at the twins. She looked at the question she'd been not quite asking herself since the moment the wagon had pulled out of the snow, the question that had been sitting at the edge of everything. What happens to us now? Before she could complete the thought, the doctor's door opened. The man who came in was not someone Gideon recognized, but Abigail clearly did not either. She sat up straighter, her posture shifting into that watchful readiness that had become her default register. He was perhaps 50, heavy-set, wearing the coat of a town official and the expression of someone who had been given an unpleasant task and was performing it with professional neutrality. "Miss Reed?" he said. "Yes," Abigail said. "I'm Sheriff Dale Morrow. I'm sorry to come so early. I wanted to speak to you and your brother before—" He glanced at the younger children, then back. "Before the day gets further along." "What about?" she said. The sheriff looked at Gideon briefly, and Gideon stood, not aggressively, simply to be standing, which was different from sitting, which was different from absent. The sheriff registered this and made no objection. "There have been inquiries," Morrow said, pulling a chair from the wall and sitting down with the deliberate movements of a large man who has learned to make himself seem smaller in confined spaces. "About your father. Since last night when word spread about you and the children arriving, I've had 3 people in the valley tell me things that—" He stopped and started again. "I'm going to be direct with you, Miss Reed, because I think you'd prefer that." "I would," she said. "There are people saying that your father left deliberately, left you all with intent to—" Another stop. "That he knew the storm was coming, and he ran." The room went very quiet. Elias had turned from the wash basin. He was standing perfectly still with the towel in his hands, and his face doing something that was not quite expressible. Caleb had looked up from the bread. Lucy had gone still with Samuel. And Abigail. Abigail sat in the chair beside her baby sister's makeshift cradle, and she looked at the sheriff. And her face went through something that Gideon watched and did not look away from, because she deserved to have a witness to it. First disbelief, then something like cold fury, then pain, then the careful, deliberate reassembly of control over all of those things. "That's not true," she said. "I'm not saying it is," Morrow said quickly. "I'm telling you what's being said, and I'm telling you because I think you need to know, and because I intend to find out the truth." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Your father's horse was found 3 days ago, about 12 miles northwest of here, near the Garner River crossing." A silence. "The river," Elias said. His voice was careful and flat and very controlled. "The river was running high," Morrow said. "The thaw we had before the storm, it had swollen the crossing by 2-3 feet above normal. The horse was on the near bank. It had—" He stopped. He looked at Abigail. It had tried to cross and come back. "But my father," Abigail said. The sheriff met her eyes. His were gray and weathered and held the specific quality of someone who has had to say hard things many times and has not become callous about it but has become steady. "We found his coat," he said, "on the far bank." Another silence. This one different from the others. This one with weight in it. Gideon looked at Elias. The boy had gone very still, the towel held motionless in both hands, and his face, the face that had been so carefully controlled for so many days, had stopped being controlled. Not broken, not collapsed. Something more complicated than that. The face of someone receiving confirmation of a thing they had already known and had been hoping anyway to be wrong about. "He was trying to cross," Abigail said. "Not a question. Everything we can determine says yes," Morrow said. "He was heading toward Ridgefield. There's a doctor in Ridgefield, and there used to be a woman who—" He checked himself, glanced at Lucy and Caleb, modified his language. "A woman who could have helped with the babies. He knew about her from before." "He was going for help," Abigail said. "For the twins." "Yes, ma'am." The ma'am fell into the room like something accidentally dropped, slightly too large for its surroundings. This formal address aimed at a 14-year-old girl. But it was not wrong. It landed without absurdity. Caleb put down the piece of bread he'd been holding. He put it down very carefully, as if carelessness with it might break something. His chin was doing the thing Abigail recognized, trembling, held in check by a will that was frankly extraordinary for 12. "He didn't leave us," Caleb said. He wasn't asking. He was saying it out loud so that the air could hold it, so that it could exist in the world as a spoken thing rather than just a known one. He was trying to reach help. He was trying to get to us. Until his very last moment, the sheriff said quietly. That's what the evidence says. What happened to the children then did not happen in the dramatic way that such moments are sometimes depicted. No one collapsed. No one cried out. There was no single overwhelming eruption of grief that swept through the room like a wave. What happened was quieter than that, and in its quietness more devastating. Caleb's chin stopped trembling, because the truth had arrived at last, and the truth, even the terrible kind, has a way of bringing a different quality than uncertainty. He sat down on the edge of the cot, and he pressed both hands flat against his knees, and he breathed. Lucy, who had been watching him, put Samuel down in the cradle beside Hope and went to sit beside her brother, and she put her hand over one of his without speaking. Elias crossed the room to Abigail. He sat beside her chair on the floor, which meant his head was below her level, and he leaned his back against the chair's leg, and he tipped his head back to rest on the armrest near her knee. It was a posture he hadn't assumed since he was much younger, instinctive, childlike in its simplicity, an older brother briefly reassuming the position of someone who needed to be near his sister. Abigail put her hand on his shoulder and left it there. Gideon stood quietly near the wall, making himself peripheral, because this was not his moment and he understood it. But he watched. He watched Abigail's face, which had gone to something he had not seen there before, not the controlled steadiness, not the managed pragmatism. Something rawer than that. The face of a daughter who had feared the worst possible thing about her father and had just been told she was wrong, that the worst possible thing had been the best possible thing, that he had not stopped fighting for them, that he had ridden into a flooded river in the dark, trying to reach them. She closed her eyes. She kept her hand on Elias's shoulder. She breathed. When she opened her eyes, they were wet, undeniably, completely, for the first time since Gideon had known her. But her voice, when she spoke, was her voice. "Thank you for telling us," she said to Sheriff Morrow, "and for telling us yourself, rather than letting us hear it from someone else." Morrow stood. He held his hat in both hands. "There are some people in this town saying things about your father that are not true and not fair, and I intend to correct them, officially and publicly and as soon as possible." He looked at the children in the room, at Caleb and Lucy on the cot, at Elias on the floor, at the twins in their drawer and their crate, at Abigail in the chair. "Your father was doing what a man does," he said, "what a father does. People need to know that." He left. The room was quiet. Samuel broke it, as Samuel reliably broke silences, with a declarative and businesslike announcement of hunger. Lucy went to him automatically, and the movement released something in the room. A breath, a slight easing, the world resuming its ordinary operations around the thing that had just happened. Caleb looked up from his knees. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "He knew we'd manage," he said. "That's why he went. He knew Abigail would manage." "Don't put that on me," Abigail said quietly, not harshly. "I'm not putting it on you. I'm saying he trusted you." Caleb looked at her directly. "He was right to." Abigail said nothing. She looked at the floor and she let the words sit with her, and the room let her sit with them. It was Gideon who eventually moved, not to speak, not to intrude on the grief, but because something practical had presented itself in the form of a knock at the door, which opened to admit Clara Webb with fresh goat's milk and another woman behind her carrying a basket that smelled strongly and wonderfully of actual cooked food. Clara assessed the room in a single glance, took in the red eyes, the specific quality of the silence, the way the children were arranged around each other, and asked no questions. She went directly to the twins, checked Hope, checked Samuel, reported briefly and professionally to Abigail on Hope's night, had fed 3 times, good strong pull by the 3rd, good color, good temperature, and then sat down and got on with what needed doing. The other woman, who introduced herself as Vera Hollis, the wife of the sawmill owner, set her basket on the table and began unpacking it with the calm of someone who has decided that food is the appropriate response to most situations and is committed to this philosophy completely. There was a beef stew, still warm. There was bread, fresh enough to be steaming when she cut it. There was a jar of apple butter and a jar of pickled beets and a small cloth-covered dish that turned out to contain a slice of cake. Caleb looked at the cake with an expression that journeyed in about 3 seconds from grief to disbelief to something approaching reverence. Is that for us? He said. All of it's for you, Vera said briskly. Now sit down and eat before it gets cold, all of you, including you. This last directed at Gideon, who had been intending to step outside and check on his horses, and had apparently been accurately identified as someone likely to exempt himself from being cared for. He sat down. They ate. All of them. Abigail, Elias, Caleb, Lucy, with Samuel on her lap. Gideon at the end of the table, slightly outside the family configuration and slightly inside it. The stew was hot and real and tasted like the opposite of everything the last 6 days had tasted like. Caleb ate with the wholehearted, uncomplicated dedication of a 12-year-old who has been adequately afraid and is now overjoyed to have something as straightforward as hunger to contend with. Nobody spoke much. There was a kind of companionable silence that had settled over the table. Not the grim silence of the cabin, but something different, something that had room in it for the grief and the relief to coexist without demanding that anyone sort them out immediately. After a while, Lucy said, "Can I have the cake now, or do we have to wait?" Vera Hollis said, "You can have the cake now." And Lucy said, "Good," with a satisfaction that made Elias laugh. An actual laugh, short and surprised out of him. The laugh of someone who has rediscovered that the reflex still works. It moved around the table. Caleb grinned. Abigail, watching Elias, watching the surprised pleasure in his face, smiled, and the smile reached her eyes, and Gideon, across the table, saw it, and it was the first time in the entire duration of their acquaintance that she had looked her age. Clara Webb looked up from the babies with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose work was going well. Gideon looked at his stew. He thought about the road north to his next freight stop, which he had been scheduled to reach 2 days ago. He thought about the cargo still in the wagon bed, the schedule he had already abandoned, the contract that was almost certainly already in breach. He thought about these things the way you think about something you're preparing to set down, turning it in your hands, assessing its weight one last time before letting it go. He looked at the children around the table. He looked at Abigail, who was watching Hope sleep with that expression she had, that particular fierce, exhausted, undimmable love, and who had, in the past 18 hours, trusted him with the most important things she possessed and had been right to do so. He thought about Elias, who had sat beside him on the box in the dark and told him about a man who knew horses and who had been right to go out in the storm, even though the storm had killed him, because the alternative was to stay still while his children needed help. He thought about what the alternative was to what he was considering. He thought about his freight route, his cargo, the empty road north. He thought about a 3-year-old boy who would have been 11, and about how the things you don't do accumulate in a man the same way the things you do, and take up just as much room and weigh just as much in the end. Sheriff Morrow came back in the early afternoon. He came with a man named Peterson from the county office, and the two of them sat down with Abigail and spoke in the careful, deliberate tones of officials trying to be humane while also being accurate. There were procedures, Peterson explained. There were requirements. 5 children, 2 of them newborns, with both parents gone. The county had responsibilities. There were arrangements that would need to be made, families in the valley who had expressed willingness to take a child or 2. "No," Abigail said. Peterson blinked. "Miss Reed, we stay together," she said. It was the same voice she had used in the wagon with Lucy, the same voice she had used on the first night with the stove, the voice that was not loud and not dramatic, but had a quality of absolute immovability to it. "All of us, together, whatever arrangement you make, it includes all 5 of us or it includes none." Peterson opened his mouth. Morrow put a hand on his arm. "The girl's right," Morrow said. "You separate these children after what they've been through, and you'll have to explain that decision to every person in this valley for the rest of your career." Peterson closed his mouth. A silence. Gideon, who had been standing near the door, said, "I'd like to say something." Everyone looked at him. He had not planned what he was about to say. He had been moving toward it since the table, since the laugh, since the smile on Abigail's face, moving toward it the way you move toward a decision you have actually already made and are only now finishing the paperwork on. He said it plainly, because plainness was his natural register and there was no reason to dress this up. "I intend to petition for guardianship," he said, "of all 5 children, together." The room was very quiet. Abigail looked at him. He looked back at her. He didn't elaborate, didn't justify, didn't perform. He simply held her gaze and let her see that he meant it, because she was the one who mattered here. She was the one who had earned the right to this decision more than any official or court or county representative in the territory. "You barely know us," she said. "I know you well enough," he said. "That's not how this works." "I know how it works. I'm saying I want to try." He paused. "You can say no. You can tell me to mind my own business and find another arrangement, and I will respect that without argument." He held her eyes. "But I wanted you to know that the option exists, and that I'm not offering it because I feel sorry for you." Abigail was quiet for a long moment. She looked at Elias, who was watching Gideon with those gray eyes that were so much their father's. She looked at Caleb, who was looking at the table with the expression of someone doing very serious internal calculation. She looked at Lucy, who met her gaze directly and gave a small, decisive nod that was so characteristic it almost undid her. She looked at Hope and Samuel, sleeping in their makeshift beds, growing stronger by the hour, requiring so much and offering back, in return, only the uncomplicated and absolute fact of their existence. She looked at Gideon Cross. "Why?" she said. She was asking it the same way she'd asked it in the cabin, standing in the doorway with the cold behind him, going straight to the thing that mattered, refusing the surface of it. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Because I've been moving for 8 years and I stopped for a reason I didn't understand at the time. And I think I understand it now." He paused. "And because your father got into a flooded river in the dark trying to reach people who needed him. And because I think that's the right way to measure what a man is worth." Abigail Reed looked at him for a long time. The room was very still. Then she said, "It would take some time for us to know if you, all the time you need," he said. "You'd have to be patient with Caleb. He feels things harder than it looks like." "I know. And Elias will push back on everything you tell him to do for the first month." "I'd expect nothing less." Something moved in her face, something that was not quite a smile but was close to it, and carried more than a smile would. "And me," she said quietly. "I don't trust easily. I'm going to need you to prove it." "I understand," he said. "I'm planning on it." She held his gaze. He held hers. "Okay," she said. It was a small word. It barely occupied any space in the room. But the weight of it, the weight of what it meant and what it cost and what it opened, settled over Harlan's Crossing like the snow settling after the storm. Quietly, completely, covering everything that had been broken and making the world look, in the new morning light, like something that might be built on. The legal process took 3 months. Gideon had been warned it would take longer. Peterson from the county office had laid out the requirements with the particular thoroughness of a man who derives comfort from procedure, who believes that the more steps a thing requires, the more legitimate it becomes. There were hearings to schedule and character references to obtain, and a judge in the county seat who would need to be satisfied that Gideon Cross was a man of sufficient standing and stability to assume guardianship of 5 children, 2 of them infants, all of them recently orphaned. Peterson had said 6 months, minimum, with the certainty of someone accustomed to being the final word on timelines. It took 3 months. It took 3 months because Sheriff Morrow wrote a letter that was 3 pages long and did not contain a single wasted sentence. It took 3 months because Clara Webb appeared at the county hearing and testified with the precision and authority of someone who has decided that a thing is right and intends to say so until the appropriate people agree. It took 3 months because every person in Harlan's Crossing who had watched Gideon Cross spend the weeks after the storm not resuming his freight route, but instead finding a place to stay, finding a way to be present, finding 100 practical and unremarkable ways to prove that okay had been a beginning rather than an ending. Every one of those people had apparently decided, quietly and collectively, to make their opinion known. But mostly it took 3 months because Abigail Reed had stood in front of the judge and spoken for 11 minutes without notes and without hesitation, and the judge, a man who had presided over 20 years of frontier cases and believed himself beyond being moved by testimony, had listened without interrupting, and then sat quietly for a moment afterward, and then said that he had heard enough. The day the papers were signed was a Tuesday in late March. Cold still, but with the particular quality of cold that carries within it the suggestion of its own ending, the cold that precedes spring rather than the cold that precedes more winter. Gideon had driven to the county seat alone. The children had wanted to come, and he had said no, firmly, not wanting them to sit through hours of legal proceeding and then face the possibility of disappointment in a public room. Abigail had argued. He had held his ground. She had conceded with the specific grace of someone who has learned that conceding is not the same as losing. He came back with the papers in the inside pocket of his coat. They were all waiting in the front room of the house he had been renting on the east side of Harlan's Crossing since the first week. A house that had been accumulating over 3 months, the particular character of a place that children inhabit, the boots by the door and the drawings on the table, and the specific domestic archaeology of 5 people learning to occupy space together. Caleb had made something with sticks and twine that was either a fence or a trap, or possibly a piece of abstract art, and had left it in the center of the floor. Lucy had arranged the twins' blankets on the settee with the geometric precision she brought to everything. Elias was standing at the window in the posture he had had on the wagon box, forward-looking, braced, waiting. Gideon came through the door, and they all looked at him. He took off his coat. He reached into the inside pocket, and he held up the papers. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Caleb said, "Does that mean—" "It means yes," Gideon said. What happened next was not what Gideon had expected, which was some version of celebration, noise, movement, the exuberant release of 3 months of cautious hope. What happened instead was that Lucy burst into tears, sudden and complete. The way a person cries when they have been holding something back for so long that permission to release it arrives as a shock to the system. She pressed both hands over her face and cried with the whole of herself, her small shoulders shaking, and Samuel looked up at the sound of it from his position on the rug and observed his sister's distress with the alert, curious expression of a 4-month-old who has opinions about everything. Caleb put his arm around Lucy without hesitation, which was perhaps the most grown-up thing Gideon had ever seen him do, and said, Hey, it's good crying," with the tone of someone who has been around grief long enough to know the difference between its varieties. Elias crossed the room. He stopped in front of Gideon with those gray eyes that were his father's eyes, and he extended his hand. A man's handshake, offered by a boy who had been doing a man's work for longer than anyone had a right to ask of him. Gideon took it. He held it for a moment. "Thank you," Elias said. Exactly as he had said it at McNally's way station, in the same simple, unperformed way, not for the papers, not for the legal fact of what they represented, but for the months of daily proof that had preceded them, for not leaving. "Thank you," Gideon said back, meaning something different and something equally true. Abigail had not moved from her chair. She was sitting with Hope in her arms. Hope, who at 4 months was no longer the barely breathing wisp of a thing that had terrified everyone who held her, but a solid, demanding, spectacularly opinionated infant who had apparently decided that near death in a blizzard was simply her origin story and had been making up for lost time ever since. Hope was looking at Gideon with the direct, owlish stare she had developed recently, the stare that suggested she was filing information for future reference. Gideon crossed to Abigail. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Okay," he said. She had been holding her own expression carefully for 3 months. Carefully, not in the way she'd held it in the cabin, which had been the carefulness of someone with nothing in reserve and everything depending on the performance. This was different. This was the carefulness of someone who has reserves and is learning, slowly, to trust them. She looked at the papers in his hand. She looked at Hope. She looked at the room, at Lucy and Caleb, at Elias, at Samuel on the rug looking up at the ceiling with infant philosophical gravity. "Yeah," she said. Her voice was its own kind of quiet. "Okay." She reached out and took his hand with her free one, briefly, firmly, the way you hold on to something to confirm it's real, and then released it. It was enough. Spring came. It came the way springs come on the frontier, not all at once, not generously, but in increments, each day offering slightly more of itself than the day before, the light lengthening by minutes, the mud deepening before it firmed, the creek behind the east pasture swelling with snowmelt before it settled into its summer register. Gideon had leased a property 2 miles outside of Harlan's Crossing, 40 acres, a solid barn, a house that needed work and got it, because Elias turned out to have an instinct for structure and repair that surfaced the moment there was something worth repairing. The boy had started the first week by replacing 3 boards on the back porch that had gone soft with winter rot. He had done it without asking, without announcing, had simply appeared one morning with the tools from the barn and begun, and by the time Gideon came out with coffee, the porch was half finished, and Elias was measuring the next board with a seriousness of purpose that foreclosed the possibility of unsolicited commentary. "You've done this before," Gideon said. "Pa taught me," Elias said, not looking up from his measurement. He said a man who can't fix what's broken in his own house is a man who's always going to be depending on someone else's. A pause. He said it better than that, but that was the idea. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Sounds like something worth knowing." "Yeah," Elias made his mark on the wood. "It is." They worked together for the rest of the morning, Gideon following the boy's lead, which was the right call, because Elias knew what he was doing and because there was something important in that. In the acknowledgement that knowledge traveled in multiple directions, that the fact of being an adult and a guardian did not make a person the authority on everything, that the boy who had held a cabin of children together for 6 days in a blizzard had things to teach. By June, Elias had rebuilt the fence line along the north pasture, fixed the barn roof, and was teaching Caleb to evaluate wagon wheels for stress fractures with the patient, slightly pedantic thoroughness of an older brother who has found something he's genuinely good at and wants to share it comprehensively. Caleb learned wagon repair the way Caleb learned everything, slowly, with enormous care, asking questions that seemed tangential but turned out to be the right questions, the questions that got to the root of why a thing worked the way it worked, rather than just how to make it work. He had their mother's mind, Abigail thought, watching him, the kind of mind that needed to understand the whole architecture before it could be comfortable with any particular room. He had also, quietly and without fanfare, begun drawing. The drawings had started appearing on scraps of paper in the first weeks at the rented house. Rough sketches, initially, the kind of thing a bored 12-year-old produces. But they had evolved quickly into something more deliberate. Horses, mostly. The mountains to the west, their profiles as seen from the ranch's north fence. The barn at dusk, its shadow long on the spring grass. Once, a careful likeness of Hope and Samuel asleep in their shared cradle, drawn from memory with a precision that had stopped Gideon in the hallway when he'd found it. He had stood looking at it for a while. Then he had gone to find Caleb. "This is remarkable," he said, holding it up. Caleb looked at the drawing with the evaluative eye of someone not entirely satisfied with his own work. "The shadows on Samuel's face are wrong." "Caleb." "They are. The whole thing is remarkable. Do you know that?" The boy looked at him with the particular expression he had when he was receiving something he wanted and wasn't sure he was allowed to want. "Ma used to say I had an eye," he said. "I didn't know what that meant until I started drawing more." "She was right," Gideon said. He set the drawing down carefully, as if it were something that deserved that care. "Don't stop." Caleb looked at the drawing, then at Gideon. "I won't," he said. Lucy, that summer, filled the house with sound. This was not a metaphor. She filled it with actual, literal, continuous sound. Singing, talking, the sound of her feet on the board floors at a pace that suggested she had somewhere to be at all times. The sound of her reading aloud to the twins because she had decided at some point that they could understand more than people gave them credit for, and she intended to test this theory comprehensively. She had developed a particular repertoire of songs for Hope and Samuel, different songs for different moods and different times of day, a system she had apparently developed with the instinct of an experienced caregiver and the certainty of someone who has field-tested her methods and found them sound. She had also, sometime in May, decided to learn to cook. She had gone about this in the way she went about everything she decided to do, directly, systematically, and with a specific quality of confidence that had nothing to do with competence and everything to do with conviction. The first 3 attempts had produced results that were educational, if not appetizing. Gideon had eaten all of them without complaint. Elias had eaten his portion with the expression of a soldier performing a duty. Caleb had asked politely if he could feed his to the dog. "We don't have a dog," Lucy had said. "I know," Caleb said. "I was thinking we should get one." By June, Lucy's biscuits were genuinely good. This was not a small thing on the frontier. The twins grew with the velocity that healthy babies grow when they have been given adequate food and warmth and love in sufficient quantities, which at the Cross Ranch that summer were available in abundance. Samuel grew in a direction that was primarily outward, solid, assertive, with a constitutional confidence that suggested he intended to take up exactly as much space as he needed and slightly more. He had reached the stage of pulling himself upright by clutching whatever was nearest and regarding the vertical world with the satisfied expression of a conqueror. Hope grew upward, longer, lighter, with her mother's dark eyes and an expression of thoughtful attention that seemed, even at 6 months, to be taking measurements. She laughed later than Samuel, but when she laughed, it was the kind of laugh that made whatever room she was in better than it had been. She had become specifically attached to Gideon in the way that infants sometimes fasten onto a person, not preferentially, not exclusively, but with a particular recognition, as if she had filed him carefully in the category of person who was there in the important moment and had decided this mattered. He felt it matter every time she reached for him, every time it surprised him, and every time the surprise was the same. Not that she trusted him, but that he had become the kind of man she could. It was Abigail who changed most visibly that summer, which was perhaps because she had been holding herself most tightly during the months of uncertainty, and the release of that tension was visible in proportion. She was still serious. She would always be serious. It was in her character the way blue is in a particular sky, present regardless of conditions. But the seriousness was no longer the seriousness of someone managing a crisis. It was the seriousness of someone engaged with a life, which is different in ways that are difficult to articulate but immediately perceptible. She had started helping Vera Hollis at the dry goods store 2 mornings a week, more for the company and the sense of contributing than for the money, though the money was useful. She had made a friend, a girl her own age named Josephine, the blacksmith's daughter, who had the kind of frank, comfortable manner that Abigail matched and appreciated, and with whom she had been observed on several occasions laughing in the unselfconscious way that 14-year-olds who have not spent 6 months managing trauma are supposed to laugh. Gideon had seen it once, through the store window, and had stood on the boardwalk longer than he needed to, letting himself see it. In August, she came to him with something she'd been carrying for a while. He could tell by the way she appeared in the barn doorway on a weekday morning when she didn't usually seek him out, and by the deliberateness of her approach, and by the particular quality of the pause before she spoke. "I've been thinking about what happens when I'm older," she said. She sat down on the barrel beside his workbench with the directness that was entirely her own. "When I'm 17, 18, what that looks like." He put down the harness he'd been working on. "Tell me." "I want to learn more," she said. "Not just the store. There's things I want to understand that I don't. About law, about how counties work, about how people end up in situations like ours and what happens to them." She paused. "I think I want to do something with that. Help people who are in those situations." Gideon looked at her. He thought about Peterson from the county office and his 6 months minimum. He thought about what this girl had done at 17, about the 11 minutes in front of a judge, the words that had moved a man who believed himself unmovable. "There are schools in the territory," he said, "and outside of it." She met his eyes carefully. "That costs money." "I know how money works, Abigail. I'm not asking you to—" "I know you're not asking." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you that it's a problem that has a solution, and that you don't need to protect me from the cost of it." She was quiet a moment, the particular quiet of someone receiving something that required recalibration. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "When you came through that door, what did you expect?" She thought about it honestly. "Someone who would help us get to town and then go back to his route," she said. "Someone who would do the right thing in the moment and then the moment would end." "Most people would have," he said. "I know." She looked at the barn wall, at the light coming through the gaps between the boards. "I don't know why you didn't." "I think I do now," he said. "I didn't at the time, but I do now." She waited. "Because standing in that doorway and looking at what you'd built, what all of you had built, with nothing, in the worst conditions, I understood something I hadn't understood before." He paused. "That keeping yourself moving is not the same as being alive. That the things worth having require you to stop somewhere long enough to build them." He looked at her. You and your brothers and sisters were already building something. I just decided I wanted to be part of it. Abigail held his gaze for a long time. Then she nodded, once, the way she nodded when something settled inside her. Not agreement exactly, but the acknowledgement of a truth received and placed correctly. Okay, she said, then we figure out the schools. We figure out the schools, he said. She stood up and straightened her skirt and walked back toward the house with the purposeful stride of someone who has just added an item to a list that she intends to complete. Gideon picked up the harness and went back to work, and he was smiling in the way a man smiles when he is alone and has no reason to perform the expression for anyone, when it simply arrives because the world, in this particular moment, is precisely what it should be. The valley did not forget. This was the nature of frontier communities. They forgot nothing, held everything, turned the stories of their members over and over until the stories became part of the texture of the place itself, woven into the way people understood where they lived and what it required of them. The story of the Reed children and the freight hauler who stopped for the smoke became one of those stories, the kind told at tables and firesides, the kind that expanded slightly in each telling, not because people were dishonest, but because a story worth keeping tends to grow toward its own meaning. People told it the way people tell stories about the winter, with the particular gravity that the frontier reserves for its own worst moments and best ones, which are often, on this land, the same moments. They told it when new settlers arrived in the valley, uncertain and unformed, not yet knowing what the country would ask of them. They told it to their children as a specific kind of instruction, the kind that cannot be conveyed in rules or principles, but only in the account of what particular people did in a particular extremity. They told it this way, that there was a winter when 5 children survived alone in a blizzard for 6 days because the oldest one refused to stop. That a man passed on a road he might not have taken and saw smoke and stopped when he could have kept going. That a father died in a river trying to reach help for his children and was not a man who abandoned his family, but a man who went to the limit of what a man can do and beyond it. And they told it this way too, that something was built from that wreckage that none of the people involved had planned or expected. That a lonely man became a father and 5 orphan children became a family, not because the circumstances required it, but because the people chose it, each of them in their own way, at their own moment. The truth and the story were the same story. Years later, when Hope and Samuel were old enough to ask about the beginning of things, about the blizzard and the cabin and the man who had stopped on the road, it was Abigail who told them, because she was the one who had been there for all of it and remembered it complete. She told them about the stove and the dwindling wood. She told them about Elias shoveling his way to the barn in the dark. She told them about Lucy singing to them through the nights, the 2 of them then barely larger than her hands. She told them about their father, about Thomas Reed, who had gone into a flooded river in the dark because he could not bear to come back to his children without help, who had loved them with everything he had until the very last of it was gone. She told them this steadily, without softening it, because they deserved the full weight of who their father was. And she told them about Gideon, about the knock on the door and the figure in the doorway, and the particular quality of his voice when he said, "I'm going to help you." Not a promise with conditions, not a transaction, just a statement of what was going to happen, said by a man who meant it completely. Hope and Samuel listened the way children listen to stories about themselves, with the particular focused intensity of people trying to locate themselves in a narrative that preceded their memory, trying to feel the shape of the world into which they arrived. "Were you scared?" Samuel asked. He was 7 by then, and the question came from the directness that had been his since birth. "Yes," Abigail said without hesitation. "But you didn't stop." "No." "Why not?" She thought about it seriously because it was a serious question and he deserved a serious answer. "Because you were there," she said. "Both of you. And Elias and Caleb and Lucy. And I couldn't stop." Samuel considered this. "That's why people stop," he said, with the confident authority of a 7-year-old who has arrived at a principle. "When someone needs them." "That's right," Abigail said. "Like Mr. Gideon stopped." Like Gideon stopped. Hope, who had been quiet through this, as she often was, filing things, measuring them, said, "Does it still hurt when you think about it?" Abigail looked at her, this child with their mother's eyes and the particular quality of attention that had been her character since the beginning, since the night in the cabin when Abigail had held her and willed her to keep breathing. This child who had arrived in the world at the worst possible moment and had survived it and was now 7 years old and asking the right question. Sometimes, Abigail said honestly, the part about Ma and Pa, yes, that doesn't stop hurting, it just changes shape. She paused. But the rest of it, she looked around the room at the house that Elias had repaired board by board, at the drawings on the wall that Caleb had framed himself, at the sounds of Lucy's voice somewhere in the back of the house, talking to someone in the rapid, engaged way she talked to everyone, at Gideon's coat hanging by the door. The rest of it is what I'm most grateful for, every day. Hope nodded. She was absorbing this, processing it in the careful way she processed everything. I'm glad he stopped, she said simply. So am I, Abigail said. So am I. That evening, Gideon came in from the north fence where he and Elias had been working, both of them carrying the specific satisfied exhaustion of a day's labor completed well, and the house was what the house always was by evening, full, complicated, loud in the particular register of a household containing multiple children at various ages, who have opinions about everything, and no particular inclination to keep those opinions to themselves. Lucy had cooked, and the biscuits were excellent, and Caleb had drawn a picture of the horses that morning that he'd left propped against the center of the table where everyone would see it, with the casualness of someone who has learned to offer his work without apology. Samuel was in a debate with Hope about something that had escalated in his absence, and that both twins were arguing with the passionate conviction of people who are absolutely certain of their position and equally certain the other person is wrong. Abigail was at the window with a book, not reading it, watching the light go off the mountains the way she did sometimes. Just watching, just being, in the way that people allow themselves to be when they are finally, genuinely safe. Gideon stood in the doorway for a moment before anyone registered his arrival. He stood there and he looked at all of it, at the life that had assembled itself in this house from the wreckage of a blizzard, from smoke rising over an empty road, from a girl in a doorway who had said, "We need help," with her chin lifted and her voice steady. He looked at Elias setting the tools in the barn and coming up toward the house with his long stride. He looked at the drawings on the wall and the biscuits on the table and the twins arguing and Abigail at the window. He thought about a freight road in a blizzard, about smoke that he'd almost not stopped for, about the particular arithmetic of the moment when a decision is made, how small it seems from the outside, how enormous it turns out to be. He thought about a 3-year-old boy who would have been 15, and he held the thought, and it hurt the way it always hurt, and he set it down gently, the way you set down something precious in a safe place where it will not be lost or forgotten, but will not be carried at the cost of what you still have the capacity to carry. He stepped inside. He closed the door against the evening cold. The room shifted to include him. Samuel's argument pausing to register his arrival, Hope looking up with those measuring dark eyes, Lucy calling from the kitchen that the biscuits were ready and everyone needed to sit down now, Abigail turning from the window. She looked at him. He looked at her. No words needed. They had developed, over a year, the economy of people who have been through something together and no longer need to narrate the simple facts of daily existence. He sat down at the table. Caleb pointed at the drawing. "What do you think?" "The shadows on the led horse are exactly right," Gideon said. Caleb narrowed his eyes. "How do you know about shadows?" "I don't," he said, "but they look right to me." Caleb considered this, seemed to find it acceptable, and helped himself to 2 biscuits. The noise resumed. The light went fully off the mountains, and the lamps came up inside. Samuel and Hope concluded their argument, or rather exhausted it, and moved on simultaneously, the way twins sometimes do, as if they had a shared timer neither of them could see. Lucy put biscuits on the table and told everyone to stop talking for 30 seconds so she could hear herself think, which no one did. But she sat down anyway with the expression of someone who has made a principled request and has no expectation of it being honored and is at peace with this. Elias came through the door, took off his coat, looked at the table. "Biscuits," he said, with the simple, sincere appreciation of a 16-year-old who has done a day's physical work. "Sit down," Lucy said. "You're late." "I was working." "Sit down anyway." He sat down. Gideon looked down the table at all of them, at the family that had made itself out of catastrophe and stubbornness and a stranger stopping on a road, And he felt the particular thing he had been feeling for months now without quite having the vocabulary for it. The thing that was not contentment exactly, not happiness exactly, but something that contained both and was larger than either. It was the feeling of being in the right place. Outside, the mountains held the last of the light for another minute, then released it. The stars came up over the valley. The night settled in, quiet and cold, and full of the particular peace of a frontier winter that has already done its worst and cannot surprise you now. In Harlan's Crossing, 2 miles east, people were telling the story. Not tonight specifically, but on some night, in some house, at some table, someone was telling a child about the winter when 5 orphan children refused to surrender and a passing freight hauler chose to become a father. They were telling it the way all the best stories on the frontier get told, plain, without embellishment, because the plain version is already everything it needs to be. They were telling it because the land required people to know what was possible, because the country was hard and the winters were long, and it helped to know, going into them, that people had come out the other side of worse than this. The story was true. All of it. The blizzard, and the smoke, and the doorway, and the road. And the family that no one had planned gathered around a table on a March evening with biscuits and arguments, and a drawing propped in the middle, and 6 lives that had once been on the edge of disappearing, now simply and completely and irrevocably alive. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Of